Rebecca Chen had been working as a genealogy researcher for 8 years, but the mahogany desk she was examining in the estate sale felt different. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, whose grandmother had recently passed, was selling the contents of a Victorian home in Boston's Beacon Hill district that had been in the family for over a century. Most of these items belonged to my great-grandmother, Mrs. Walsh explained, watching Rebecca carefully examine a leather portfolio tucked in the desk's secret compartment. She was quite secretive about her past. We never knew much about her early life. Inside the portfolio, Rebecca found several documents and a studio photograph that made her pause. 3 young women, probably sisters, based on their similar features, posed elegantly in what appeared to be an expensive Boston photography studio. The formal inscription read, "The Whitmore Sisters, June 1912. Mrs. Walsh peered over Rebecca's shoulder. "I've never seen this photograph before. Those women look familiar, but I can't place them." Rebecca studied the image more closely. The eldest sister stood in the center, perhaps 25, wearing an elaborate dark dress with pearl buttons. The middle sister, around 22, sat gracefully in a carved wooden chair. The youngest, maybe 18, stood to the right in a lighter-colored gown. All 3 had serious expressions, typical of formal portraits from the era. But something caught Rebecca's trained eye. The youngest sister's left hand was positioned oddly, almost protectively closed around something small. Her fingers were curved in an unnatural way, as if concealing an object in her palm. "Mrs. Walsh," Rebecca said slowly, "do you have a magnifying glass? I think there's something hidden in this photograph." The elderly woman retrieved a lens from her late grandmother's sewing kit. As Rebecca examined the youngest sister's hand more closely, she could see the edge of what appeared to be a small metallic object barely visible between the girl's fingers. Dr. Amanda Foster, a photography historian at Harvard University, adjusted her professional equipment to examine the 1912 photograph. Rebecca had brought it to her laboratory the next morning, intrigued by what the youngest sister might be concealing. "The photograph is definitely authentic," Dr. Foster confirmed, studying the paper quality and printing techniques. Now, this was taken at Morrison's photography studio on Newbury Street. You can tell by their distinctive backdrop and lighting style. Rebecca leaned closer. "Can you see what she's holding?" Dr. Foster positioned the photograph under her high-resolution magnifier and carefully adjusted the lighting angles. Her expression grew curious as the details became clearer. "This is quite unusual. She appears to be holding a small piece of jewelry. Looks like a locket or pendant." The object was now clearly visible, an ornate gold locket with detailed engravings, clutched tightly in the young woman's palm. But what made it remarkable was a dark stain visible on the chain, something that looked distinctly like dried blood. "Dr. Foster," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper, "why would someone hide a blood-stained locket in a family portrait?" "That's exactly what we need to find out," Dr. Foster replied, removing her glasses thoughtfully. In 1912, formal portraits were expensive and carefully planned. Everything in the frame was deliberate. If she's hiding this locket, there's a very important reason. Dr. Foster had seen thousands of historical photographs, but she'd never encountered one where someone was clearly concealing evidence of potential violence. "Rebecca, we need to identify these sisters. If there was blood on that locket, it might be connected to a crime." The innocent family portrait had suddenly transformed into something much darker. Whatever the youngest Whitmore sister was hiding, she had chosen to preserve it in the most permanent way possible, in a photograph that would outlast her lifetime. 2 days later, Rebecca found herself in the basement archives of the Boston Public Library, surrounded by city directories, newspaper collections, and genealogical records. Dr. Foster had connected her with James Morrison, a local historian who specialized in Boston's prominent families from the early 1900s. The Whitmore family was well known in Boston society, Morrison explained, pulling thick volumes from the shelves. Well, they owned several textile mills and had significant real estate holdings in Beacon Hill and the Back Bay. His fingers traced through pages of social registers from 1912. "Here we are. Edward Whitmore, widower, 3 daughters, Margaret, the eldest, Catherine, the middle daughter, and Eleanor, the youngest. They lived at 47 Marlborough Street." Rebecca studied the photograph again. "Eleanor, the youngest sister holding the locket, would have been about 18 in 1912. Do you have any records of the family after this time?" "That's where it gets interesting," Morrison said, reaching for a different volume. "The family seems to have left Boston suddenly in late 1912. Their house was sold, their business interests transferred to other parties. It was quite unusual for such a prominent family. Hours of searching through newspaper archives revealed fragments of a story. In the Boston Globe from July 15, 1912, Rebecca found a small item buried in the society pages. Concern for missing businessman. Local authorities are investigating the disappearance of Mr. Charles Pemberton, a business associate of the Whitmore Textile. Interests. Mr. Pemberton was last seen leaving the Whitmore residence on Marlborough Street on the evening of June 20th. Family and business partners expressed growing concern, but then, strangely, no follow-up articles appeared. The story of Charles Pemberton's disappearance simply vanished from the newspapers as if it had never happened. June 20th, Rebecca noted, checking the photograph's date. And this portrait was taken just days before this man disappeared from the Whitmore house. Morrison looked troubled. Missing persons cases involving prominent families were often handled very quietly in that era. Too much publicity could damage reputations and business interests. The next morning, Rebecca stood outside 47 Marlborough Street in Boston's Back Bay, studying the elegant Victorian townhouse that had once belonged to the Whitmore family. The building was now divided into luxury condominiums, but its original architectural details remained intact. Mrs. Elizabeth Santos, who had lived in the building for 30 years and served as the resident's historical liaison, met Rebecca in the ornate lobby. "I have always been fascinated by this building's history," she said, leading Rebecca to a small archive room. Previous residents have collected quite a bit of information about the original owners. Mrs. Santos produced a folder of documents, photographs, and newspaper clippings. The Whitmore family's sudden departure in 1912 was still talked about when I moved here in the 1990s. Neighbors said they left in the middle of the night, taking almost nothing with them. Rebecca examined floor plans from 1912 and photographs of the house's interior. "Do you know anything about a man named Charles Pemberton who disappeared from this house?" "Ah, yes," Mrs. Santos said, pulling out a faded newspaper clipping. "This is from a much later article, 1952, I think. A construction crew renovating the basement found something disturbing." The article was brief but chilling. "Skeletal remains found in Back Bay home. Construction workers discovered human remains while renovating the basement of a Marlborough Street residence. Police identify the remains as those of Charles Pemberton, a businessman who disappeared 40 years ago. The case has been reopened." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. "What happened with the investigation?" "That's where it gets strange again," Mrs. Santos replied. Within days, the story disappeared from the newspapers. The police file was sealed, and the case was closed without any public resolution. But neighborhood rumors persisted for decades. Mrs. Santos lowered her voice. The story was that Charles Pemberton had been having an affair with one of the Whitmore sisters. When her father discovered their relationship, there was a confrontation that ended badly. The family covered up the murder and fled Boston to avoid scandal. Rebecca looked at the photograph again, studying Eleanor Whitmore's concealed hand. The bloodstained locket suddenly seemed much more significant, possible, evidence of a 40-year-old murder that had been successfully covered up until now. Dr. Foster's office at Harvard felt crowded with the addition of Rebecca, James Morrison, and Detective Maria Rodriguez, a Boston police investigator who specialized in cold cases. Rebecca had contacted Detective Rodriguez after discovering that the Pemberton case files, though officially closed, still existed in police archives. Murder cases from that era were handled very differently, Detective Rodriguez explained, studying copies of the original police reports. Prominent families had significant influence over investigations, especially when scandal was involved. She spread out documents from the sealed file. Charles Pemberton was a textile broker who worked closely with Edward Whitmore's business interests. He was unmarried, well-educated, and according to witnesses, had been courting one of the Whitmore daughters. Dr. Foster had been researching the social context of the era. In 1912, relationships between business associates and family members were carefully controlled. An inappropriate romance could destroy both business partnerships and family reputations. Morrison had found additional information about the Whitmore family dynamics. While Edward Whitmore was known to be extremely protective of his daughters after his wife's death, several society writers mentioned his disapproval of various suitors. Rebecca studied the police file more carefully. This witness statement says Charles Pemberton was seen arguing with someone outside the Whitmore house on the night he disappeared. The witness couldn't identify who he was arguing with, but described hearing raised voices and what sounded like a woman crying. Detective Rodriguez pointed to another document. The initial investigation focused on Edward Whitmore as the primary suspect. But look at this. 2 days into the investigation, the case was suddenly transferred to a different detective and all progress stopped. Political influence, Morrison noted. The Whitmore family had connections throughout Boston's power structure. They could have easily arranged for the investigation to be buried. Dr. Foster was re-examining the photograph under different lighting conditions. "There's something else here," she said, adjusting her equipment. "Look at Eleanor's expression compared to her sister's. She looks terrified, while they appear composed." Rebecca studied the faces more carefully. Margaret and Catherine Whitmore looked serious, but calm. Eleanor, however, had wide eyes and a tense expression that suggested fear or guilt. What if Eleanor witnessed what happened? Rebecca asked. What if she's holding evidence of her father's crime? The Massachusetts State Police Forensic Laboratory in Sudbury felt clinical and modern compared to the historical archives Rebecca had been exploring. Detective Rodriguez had arranged for them to meet with Dr. Patricia Kim, a forensic expert who specialized in analyzing historical evidence. This is highly unusual, Dr. Kim explained as she prepared to examine high-resolution photographs of the locket visible in Eleanor's hand. We rarely get to analyze potential evidence that's over a century old, especially when it's preserved in a photograph. Using advanced digital enhancement techniques, Dr. Kim was able to create detailed images of the locket and its chain. The results were remarkable and disturbing. The staining on the chain is definitely consistent with dried blood, Dr. Kim confirmed. But more importantly, I can make out an inscription on the locket itself. The enhanced images revealed delicate engraving on the locket's surface. To my dearest Eleanor, C.P., June 1912. Rebecca felt her breath catch. Charles Pemberton gave Eleanor Whitmore this locket just before he died. Dr. Kim continued her analysis. There's something else. The locket appears to be partially open, and there's something visible inside. It looks like a small piece of paper or photograph. Detective Rodriguez leaned forward. Could Eleanor have hidden evidence inside the locket? It's possible, Dr. Kim replied. Lockets were commonly used to hide personal items. If Eleanor witnessed her father murdering Charles Pemberton, she might have taken the locket as evidence and hidden proof of the crime inside. Dr. Foster had been studying the technical aspects of the photograph. Eleanor's positioning suggests she's trying to preserve the locket without her father or sisters noticing. The way she's holding it, protecting it, she knew its significance. Rebecca realized they were looking at more than just a family portrait. Eleanor Whitmore was creating evidence. She couldn't go to the police, but she could ensure that someday someone would discover the truth. The innocent studio photograph had become a calculated act of justice by a young woman who had witnessed a murder and found a way to preserve proof of the crime for future generations. Back in Boston, Detective Rodriguez had made disturbing discoveries through her contacts in the police department's historical files. The Pemberton case had been part of a larger pattern of crimes involving Boston's elite families that were systematically covered up. It wasn't just murder, Rodriguez explained as they gathered again in Dr. Foster's office. The early 1900s were filled with scandals involving wealthy families that were quietly buried. Domestic violence, financial fraud, even suspicious deaths, all handled privately to protect reputations. Rebecca studied the enhanced photographs of Eleanor's locket. How many people were involved in covering up Charles Pemberton's murder? According to these files, at least 6 police officers, 2 judges, and several city officials received payments to ensure the case disappeared. The Whitmore family had enough money and influence to buy silence at every level. Morrison had been researching what happened to the Whitmore sisters after they left Boston. I found shipping records showing the family traveled to California in August 1912. They settled in San Francisco under slightly different names, Whitmer instead of Whitmore. Dr. Foster had discovered additional photographs from California newspapers. Look at this. The sisters appeared in San Francisco Society pages within months of arriving. But Eleanor is notably absent from most social events. The California photographs showed Margaret and Catherine Whitmore integrating into San Francisco's social scene, but Eleanor rarely appeared in public. When she did, she looked withdrawn and haunted. Survivor's guilt, Detective Rodriguez suggested. She witnessed her father commit murder, took evidence, but couldn't prevent the cover-up. That kind of trauma would affect someone for life. Rebecca found Eleanor's death certificate from 1923. She had died at age 29 in a San Francisco hospital, officially from pneumonia. But a note in the margin, written by the attending physician, mentioned patient exhibited signs of severe mental distress and spoke frequently of events in Boston that continued to trouble her. She never got over what she saw, Rebecca realized. Eleanor spent 11 years carrying the secret of Charles Pemberton's murder, with only a locket as proof that it ever happened. The photograph had preserved not just an image, but the final testimony of a young woman who had tried desperately to ensure justice would eventually be served. The California State Archives in Sacramento held records that had been overlooked for decades. Morrison had discovered that Eleanor Whitmore had made several attempts to contact Boston authorities in the years before her death, trying to provide information about Charles Pemberton's disappearance. Rebecca examined copies of Eleanor's handwritten letters, dated between 1918 and 1922. The correspondence revealed a woman tormented by guilt and desperate for justice. I have evidence of what truly happened to Mr. Charles Pemberton in Boston. My father killed him in a rage when he discovered our secret engagement. I have kept the locket Charles gave me, and inside it is proof of what occurred. I cannot live with this silence much longer. But each letter had been returned unopened, stamped, case closed, no further correspondence accepted. Dr. Foster had made an extraordinary discovery in Eleanor's personal effects, which had been donated to a San Francisco Historical Society after her death. Among her belongings was a detailed diary, written in code, that documented the night of Charles Pemberton's murder. Using historical code-breaking techniques, they had deciphered Eleanor's account. June 20th, 1912. Charles came to ask Father for my hand in marriage. Father became enraged, accused Charles of trying to steal our family's business secrets through me. The argument escalated. Father struck Charles with the fireplace poker. Charles fell and did not rise again. Eleanor's diary revealed that she had witnessed the entire confrontation from the staircase. Father and Margaret disposed of the body in the basement coal cellar. Catherine helped clean the blood. They made me swear never to speak of it, threatening to send me to an asylum if I ever told anyone. But Eleanor had kept Charles's locket, which contained a photograph of the two of them together and a copy of Charles's letter to Edward Whitmore asking for Eleanor's hand in marriage, proof of the innocent nature of their relationship. She preserved evidence of both the murder and Charles' honorable intentions, Rebecca realized. The locket proved that Charles wasn't trying to steal business secrets. He genuinely loved Eleanor. The studio portrait had been Eleanor's final desperate attempt to preserve the truth. By concealing the bloodstained locket in the photograph, she had created an unalterable record that would outlast all attempts to destroy the evidence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh called Rebecca with urgent news about additional items found in her great-grandmother's house. During renovation work, contractors had discovered a sealed envelope hidden inside a wall cavity. The envelope contained Eleanor Whitmore's final letter, written just days before her death in 1923, along with detailed instructions for what should be done with the locket. To whoever finds this letter, I am Eleanor Whitmore, and I carry the burden of witnessing a murder that was never punished. Charles Pemberton was killed by my father, Edward Whitmore, on June 20th, 1912, in our home at 47 Marlborough Street in Boston. The locket I hid in our family portrait contains proof of Charles's innocence and evidence of the crime. Eleanor's letter included precise instructions for finding additional evidence she had hidden in various locations, including detailed maps and coded references that Morrison was able to decipher. Following Eleanor's directions, they discovered that she had hidden copies of documents throughout her time in California, in banks, with lawyers, even sealed in the walls of buildings she had lived in. Each cache contained pieces of evidence about Charles Pemberton's murder and the subsequent cover-up. Detective Rodriguez had worked with federal authorities to officially reopen the Pemberton case. Even though the primary perpetrators are long dead, we can still provide official closure and clear Charles Pemberton's name. Dr. Foster had arranged for the locket itself to be located and analyzed. Following Eleanor's instructions, they found it in a safety deposit box in San Francisco that had been paid for in advance for decades. Inside the locket, exactly as Eleanor had described, were Charles's photograph and his letter proposing marriage. Charles Pemberton was murdered for wanting to marry Eleanor Whitmore, Rebecca announced to the gathered investigators. Eleanor spent her life ensuring that someday the truth would come out. Mrs. Walsh wept as she learned her family's connection to Eleanor's story. She lived in our house for her final years. We were the family that gave her sanctuary, just like she had hoped someone would eventually give sanctuary to the truth. 6 months after the discovery, Rebecca stood in the Charles Pemberton Memorial Garden, a small plot in Boston's Public Garden dedicated to victims of unsolved crimes. The Pemberton case had sparked renewed interest in historical injustices and led to the formation of a cold case unit specifically focused on crimes involving abuse of power. Dr. Foster had worked with the Boston Police Department to create a comprehensive report on the Pemberton murder and cover-up. The case became a textbook example of how wealthy families in the early 1900s could manipulate the justice system to escape consequences for serious crimes. Eleanor Whitmore was a hero, Dr. Foster noted. She risked her mental health and family relationships to preserve evidence of a crime. Her courage eventually brought justice to Charles Pemberton. Detective Rodriguez had used Eleanor's evidence to identify patterns of corruption in Boston's police department that had persisted for decades. The Pemberton case opened up investigations into dozens of other suspicious cases from the same era. Morrison had traced the descendants of both families across the country. Charles Pemberton's family had spent over a century believing he had abandoned his responsibilities and disappeared voluntarily. Learning the truth brought them closure and allowed them to honor his memory properly. Mrs. Walsh had donated the original photograph and Eleanor's letters to the Boston Historical Society, where they were displayed as part of an exhibit on hidden histories, crimes and cover-ups in early Boston. Rebecca often returned to look at the studio portrait, now properly preserved and displayed with full context. When visitors asked about the object in Eleanor's hand, she would explain how one young woman's determination to preserve truth had ultimately brought justice to a century-old murder. The Whitmore sisters' case inspired new research into other historical photographs, where people might have hidden evidence of crimes or injustices. Universities established programs encouraging students to look more carefully at historical images for signs of concealed stories. Most importantly, Eleanor's story reminded people that bearing witness to injustice, even when unable to immediately seek help, can still serve justice if one is clever and persistent enough to preserve the truth for future generations. The Innocent Studio, a photograph that had seemed to show three sisters posing together, had revealed itself to be something far more significant. A young woman's desperate but successful attempt to ensure that murder would not go unpunished forever, and that love would ultimately triumph over violence and corruption.